Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Institute for Critical Animal Studies ninth annual Ecoability Conference. We have a great lineup this year. I am very excited. I am your host, Laura Schleifer. I am the conference director of the Institute for Critical Animal Studies. And a bit about the Institute. The Institute for Critical Animal Studies is rooted in animal liberation and anarchism and is an international, intersectional, transformative, holistic theory to action, activist led based scholarly think tank to unapologetically explain, be in solidarity with, and be part of a radical and revolutionary actions, theories, groups, and movements for total liberation and to dismantle all systems of domination and oppression in hopes for a just, equitable, inclusive, and peaceful world. This conference is co-sponsored by the Ecoability Collective. And the Ecoability Collective was founded in 2012, and it's a collective of activists who view the oppression of all beings interlinked and work to end all forms of oppression by working toward total liberation and social justice. Ecoability Collective provides a forum and a place for people to talk about how ecological destruction intersects with human identity and how discrimination against the disabled body goes hand in hand with discrimination against non-human animals. And we are really lucky to have a number of members of the Ecoability presenting here today. So for our first speaker, we are going to be hearing from Dr. Gregor Wolbring. And Dr. Wolbring is going to be speaking on ally burnout. So Dr. Gregor Wolbring is a tenured full professor at the University of Calgary's Cummings School of Medicine, Community Health Science, Program in Community Rehabilitation and Disability Studies, and the academic director, Disability and Accessibility at the Office for Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. He is presently also a member of the Institute for Technology Assessment and Systems Analysis. Karlsruhe, Germany, and a senior fellow of the Institute for Science, Society, and Policy at the University of Ottawa, Canada. As to former appointments, he was the president of the Canadian Disability Studies Association and a member of the executive committee of the Canadian Commission for UNESCO. He sees ability studies, including ecoability studies, disability studies, sustainability studies, science and technology governance studies, sports, and equity, diversity, and inclusion as his 6 main topic areas. So he is going to be speaking on one of those areas today. He's going to be speaking on burnout. That is probably a subject matter that many attendees of this conference can relate to on some level. I know I certainly can. And Dr. Wolbring, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Laura. And okay, you guys should see now the PowerPoint, hopefully.
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah. All right. Thanks for having me. And indeed, burnout, stressors, and allyship, disabled people and beyond is very topical, I think, for many people, not just within the Ecoability collective. I think there's a lot of issues. And I have 3 papers on that. People can read them open access if they want. First, thank you to my funders. And even more, thank you to my student group, the Volpack. You can read, more about them if you want. We do many topics, as was already alluded to. And noteworthy what my students is that they're all bachelor students. Many of them start with me right in year 1. So this is just, a great group. And if someone wants to read about what they think about undergraduates being researchers, you can do that there. So now as to the topic, environmental activism and disabled people. We hear definitely a lot about environmental activism, whether it's COP28 and in other areas, but we hear much less about how this relates to disabled people. The Ecoability Collective obviously is very much into environmental activism and disabled people. There are different impacts of environmental activism on disabled people. One is potential arguments, like preventing impairments for environmental actions, like we're saying, right, we're environmental toxins, and then you use disabled people, you objectify them and saying, oh, autism is caused by an environmental toxin, for example. That was a narrative quite a few years ago. And that means you need a medical narrative of disabled people in order to sell action against environmental toxins. Another one is you're right, you'd want to have certain things changed, like the single straw, plastic straw prohibition, right, is seen as an environmental activism goal. Unfortunately, it has huge problems, I mean, in relation to many disabled people who absolutely depend on the single straw. But within the environmental activism movement, in general, the literacy around disabled people is rather low. And then, of course, there are technologies as a solution to environmental issues, like geoengineering is showing up again, or like human enhancement. So, in essence, you modify the human so they can be resistant to climate change, like the ozone layer and so on. When we looked at youth environmental activism and disabled people in the academic coverage of 5,533 abstracts, zero covered children and youth with disabilities as environmental activists. And you can read more about that. When I ask students about the impact of environmental activism on disabled people, they are saying that there are positive and negative impacts. That means we really have to look at what environmental activism does to disabled people. We know there are problems between disabled people and the environmental movement. I just use here some from Fanny, who wrote a lot about that. This is a positive development. That is, Jordan has a whole network around inclusive climate action research program. This is from 2021, and it's about saying, ABC News saying that disabled climate activists have burnout. And that's the same in a Greenpeace, blog piece by Melissa Parker. So we published, therefore, because we looked at burnout, and then we published a burnout paper. There are three areas for burnout. One is workplace burnout, right? It's just that in the way your workplace is, it leads to physical, emotional, and mental exhaustion. That is a traditional one, no surprise there. And then, right, you often burn out, you don't want to work, and so on and so on. But of course, there's also a concept like activist burnout, which is defined as long-term activism-related stressors deteriorate activist physical or emotional health or sense of connectedness to their movement, impacting their effectiveness or abilities to remain engaged. And making matters worse, burnout begets burnout as movements work is taken up by fewer people who then begin to burn out, engage less effectively, and take out their hopelessness on fellow activists. And then there's problem-based burnout or life burnout. This is simply a description about racism burnout, which is in essence, right, having a systemic discrimination based on race, right? It builds up and eventually there's a drop in the bucket, right, where everything flows over. We, of course, have that, realized like sexism, racism, discrimination, microaggression, or inequities may all influence the individual experience of burnout. Or lesbian, gay, or bisexual students report higher mistreatment specific to sexual and they had an 8-fold higher predicted probability of burnout compared with heterosexual students. This is from the paper, one of the results that we do actually not use these terms conceptually. Discrimination burnout, adaptation burnout, sexism burnout, LGBTQ2S plus phobia burnout, transphobia. These terms simply do not exist in the literature around. And then, of course, the life burnout also is for disabled people. In short, disabled people face systemic disableism, discrimination based on their body and mind abilities in their daily life that all can lead to burnout. No surprise. right? And this is from Carol Gill, who was the Disability Studies Program Director in Chicago for many years. And in essence, she outlines all the problems disabled people face in society. And that might lead then to what is known in the disability community as disability burnout. This term refers to emotional despair engendered by thwarted opportunities and blocked goals. It is aggravated and intensified by years of exposure to disability prejudice and devaluation. Autistic burnout exists also as a term. An autistic burnout is described as a debilitating condition that severely impacts functioning, is linked to suicidal ideation, and is driven by the stress of masking. So, in essence, behaving as one is not, and living in an unaccommodating neurotypical world. So, within the autistic community, obviously, in the neurodiverse community, this term is very much used. So when we then looked at burnout, looking at all kind of academic databases, we literally use all kind of different angles. There are 12 equity, diversity, inclusion phrases and 5 EDI policy frameworks. None mention disabled people in relation to burnout. Then there are 764 abstracts to cover burnout in relation to disability terms. But literally, the majority is about disabled people causing the burnout of other people. Only 30 of the 764 covered the burnout of disabled people, 8 using the term autistic burnout. Disabled activist burnout was not covered once in the literature. Disability burnout was not mentioned once in abstract either. You have to go to full text search to find 7 of them. Discrimination burnout, stigma burnout, all are not present as concepts in the literature, academic literature. Social stressor paper, we looked at disabled people being covered, their social stress they experience. And reality is literally the same. Of 1,809 abstracts, we literally found only 52 relevant ones where they looked at the stressors disabled people experience. Emergency and disaster terms linked to management planning and preparedness. Of the 911 abstracts, 3 covered social stressors of disabled people, as do EDI, only 1. And so on, it goes on. Essex field, nothing. Eco-anxiety as a term used a lot, climate change anxiety. Of all the abstract who have these terms, not one covering disabled people. Right, so it goes on and on. So again, discrimination stress, stigma stress, stress identifying technology approaches, disaster stress, all do not exist. And then ally, right? Because it's of course important. We know that, I mean, what is expected of an ally? There's a lot of literature out there. What we do less know about is, right, about what is in our paper showed is not there, is the danger for the ally, the burnout danger of the ally, the challenges to the, right? Indeed, ally burnout does not exist very much in the literature. So we went through it again, and realities, I don't show that, but it is really about that allies are really covered in a very superficial fashion. I mean, it says, okay, we need allies, and then some topics, and some are missing. But there's really nothing out there, which we had only 6 full texts, which suggest that they're looking into, right, the challenges an ally is facing. And obviously, right, there are challenges. Ally challenges in environmental activism. A is that different people have different ability expectations. COP28, prime example. We could use ability expectation as an enabling framework, ecofeminist framework, right? Ecoability framework, anthropocentricism to ecocentrism, and the sustainable development concept was set up to have a better ability expectations humans should have of nature. But of course, we have a lot of disabling use within the environmental context, like ability, identity, security. Can you be secure in your identity based on your abilities? This transforming our world, the key, right, SDG 2030 document, point 26 says, we are committed to the prevention and treatment of non-communicable diseases, including behavioral, developmental, and neurological disorders, which constitute a major challenge for sustainable development. neurological disorder, this is the definition for a learning disability. Right, so all the neurodiverse people, then of course Down syndrome, and. So a part of the SDG is to get rid of these groups, and then you blame them for not having sustainable development, right? And that hardly gets picked up. I think the only group I ever saw really mentioning that is the Autistic right self-advocacy network. Ability inequities, right? An unjust or unfair distribution of access to and protection from abilities generated through human intervention. This is Desmond Tutu, right? The late one. Adaptation, right? We talked about adaptation apartheid, which in some ways was part of COP28. Put bluntly, the world's poor are being harmed through a problem that is not of their making. Leaving the world's poor to sink or swim with their own meager resources in the face of the threat posed by climate change is morally wrong. And we are drifting into a world of adaptation apartheid. That plays them out with the Pacific Islands, who think like, well, we're not far enough because they're the first ones go under, right, if the sea level goes up. And that is also linked to ability privilege. The advantage is enjoyed by those who exhibit certain abilities to obtain others, right? If you have money, you can do certain things, like green consumption. Mengel highlighted that certain forms of consumption, such as buying local, driving a hybrid, or even voluntary simplicity, often conferred moral weights, despite the fact that the ability to make such choices relies on a systemic unearned privilege. They say goes by being white and middle class. Right, but I think it's really an ability privilege. It's not just being a man white and middle class. If you have a certain ability, set of abilities in your body, you can get certain education, you can get certain jobs, and obviously disabled people do not get these jobs because we are missing. But green consumption is one area of right privilege. So we talk a lot about privilege, right? But ability privilege is very little used. And you can see I had this in the Journal for Critical Animal Studies back in 2014. So conclusion, many problems disabled activists and their allies face. But there's a lack of academic engagement with the challenges and lack of data. And with that, it's very hard then to demand change if we, do not even have the data from where we can. So intuitively, we all know that, we burn out as activists because we're doing things for God. The last 30 years, I do this work like here in Canada, and from what I can see, like accessibility-wise, it's still the same problem. In some areas actually gets worse. And we have more and more issues, right, around now artificial intelligence or robotics, or we constantly add new issues to the disabled activists and the allies of disabled people, whether it's a disabled person being allied to another disabled person or a non-disabled person to a disabled person. We add more to it, and the old problems haven't been solved. Right? And that's a big problem. That's why I wrote these 3 pieces. And that's it. Cheers.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wolbring. That was very, very interesting and very eye-opening. So if you have questions, please put them in the chat. And so far, I'm not seeing any questions. So I will ask a question while we're waiting. I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on why this topic has been so avoided in the academic literature. They're looking at all these other forms of oppression, intersectionality, and all of this, and how that would impact someone as an activist to make that more difficult for them. But yet, there's this gaping hole when it comes to disability. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on why that is.
Oh, I have thoughts on everything.
Sure.
I think in the way we are labeled, right? If you're labeled within a medical framework, right, then that would not apply because you can see this in all kinds of topics, right? Why is it that we are not covered in environmental activism, in youth environmental activism, or as the impact of right? Environmental issues on disabled people in environmental education literature. Or, I mean, we could go on and on and on, right? So the activist is just one. And it's quite interesting. There is a very active group, Paul Gorky, right, on activism burnout. And he focused on social justice activism burnout, right? But the one group he's totally missing is disabled activists, right? He has animal and all kind of stuff in there. It's also an issue that other movements often objectify disabled people for their social justice, right? I mean, for people who know the history of me, I'm a thalidomide person. So I was born with a non-normative body. And of course, the animal rights groups were using this image of thalidomide people to say, look at that, animal testing doesn't work, right? But in order for that argument to work, they have to be already know that there is a negative imagery of if you don't have certain legs and arms and so on. And that stays with people, right? The same as environmental toxins. How do you sell to get rid of them, right? You need a group, a reason, and then you use disabled people saying, look at that, you become impaired. Right? So all of that leads to, the first time I published on climate change in disabled people was in 2009. That did not give me accolades within the academic system. That did not get me grants in the academic system because climate change, and disabled people, climate change as itself was already a no-no, but with disabled people, right? And many then, I think, can't do this work because they need, their promotion, they need their merit, right? So you need funding. And if you know that the topic is not doing much for you, right, because you can't get it funded, then you go for another topic, right? Because you need to pay your bills, right? And as an activist, in the same thing. If you are for 30 years, if you see as a new activist, look at that person worked on that topic 30 years ago and is still working on it. An activist wants to see some changes. If you're saying, I work on something now for 30 years and it's still not, then you will not even get people into it, right? And then we have the hierarchies between social groups. And disability, because of the medical label, is all the time at the bottom, together with indigenous people. These are the two groups which are normally on the bottom of everything when you look at it hierarchy-wise.
Very interesting. Definitely a lot to chew on with that. Yeah. So we do have a question that came in, and the question actually is from Daniel Salomon, one of our other presenters today. And Daniel asks, when I explained your paper on eco-ableism, ability expectations, um, and he understood eco-ableism, but not ability expectation is an expectation for oneself, which is how you interpreted it. So are activists your audience? Oh, I see. He just messaged again. Okay, so I'm going to read this again because that was a little bit confusing. So Daniel was speaking to one of his advisors, and he tried to explain your paper. And so when he described it to his advisor, he said that your paper on eco-ableism, ability expectations, so his advisor understood eco-ableism, but not ability expectation.
Yeah.
So Daniel was wondering, is an expectation for oneself, which is how he interpreted it, um, are activists your audience?
Yeah, okay. When I coined ability studies, right, Fiona Campbell did studies in ableism and so on. When I coined it, I came from the enhancement debate. So I went also beyond disabled people. That's why I fit so nicely. And there I already talked about human nature relationships, right, totally independent of disabled people. But I think there is a timeline. You're starting with something, a new ability shows up, and some people find them eclectic and useful, right? Cool, right? Then it becomes, more taken up because people see that as useful. right? But these are still ability expectations. So you expect something, but it's not essential yet. Then you get ableism is the next step, which then is something is absolutely essential. Like nowadays, you need a cell phone because the multifactorial authentication universities use, you need a cell phone to get the code, right? So if you don't have a cell phone, you can't get into any account anymore, right? So now this ability to have a cell phone is actually an essential. Then the next step is that abilities also become obsolete, right? The Luddites was the very thing about that they felt the abilities they had were becoming obsolete because they were, I mean, the machines could do it better. Right, back the weavers, back in the right hundreds of years ago, right? So, and we have that today again. You get replaced because the abilities a machine has is better than your own, right? And that means we have constantly this cycle. Some abilities show up, right? Some will never become an essential because they're too weird or whatever, right? Then some become, and ability expectation. So I use them therefore in these three stages, right? Ability expectation, ableism, ability obsolescence, right? And eco-ableism is the same thing, right? It's only, for example, human nature, right? We are trying to change the ability expectations we have from nature, or the ableism, right? The ableism that you have to be able to consume as is. And that's what the problem at COP28, because different groups simply have to see different abilities as essential, right, which nature gives them. And they're often irreconcilable, right? It's like ability conflicts, right? But that's why, I mean, an ability, I mean, identity is really about, right? If you can't see yourself, I mean, at ease with your own abilities you have, because others see you have to have other, right? That's why we have this ability, identity, insecurity, and so on, right? But it's really three stages, right? And that's why I'm different to the same as I make a distinction between ableism and disableism, right? Ableism is just that one sees a certain ability as essential. What you do with that is you can disable people by saying you don't have it. But EDI, I could easily say, I want to live in an equitable, diverse, and inclusive society. That would be an enabling use of ableism, of an ability expectation. The capability approach from Sen is about the ability to have a good life. These are about ability expectations humans should have, right? So I don't use ableism as a negative. It's just a given. Okay, this is certain abilities which are essential, and different places really have, like a hunter-gatherer society has totally different ability expectations of their members than a post-knowledge society or agricultural society, right? And so depending what the framework is, different abilities flow to the top. I don't know whether that actually answered Daniel's, I mean, right, thing, but it's much more differentiated, that approach, than just saying ableism equals discrimination against disabled people, which puts us again into a silo instead of being able to question the disabling use of abilities in general. Right? That's why I developed it in a way that can't be ghettoized, as in, oh, it's only disabled people, and then no one else thinks has any relevance to them. Because really everyone gets judged. Women, right? We know suffragette movement, right? Man decided rationality is important as an ability, and man decided women aren't rational, right? And then man decided women can't vote. And then women internalized that, right? They internalized that they're not rational and that they're not allowed to vote, because that is not our role in society, which is internalized. The first is internalized ableism. The other one is internalized disableism, right? And I better stop here.
That's really interesting. And Daniel says, yes, you did clear up his question, and he is looking forward to sharing your response with his advisor. Um,
Thank you.
so I don't see any more questions. Um, I just want to say that that was very interesting. Kind of the distinction that you drew between ableism versus disableism. If I'm understanding it correctly, it sounds like really ableism is much broader in the sense of, because everybody is going to have some areas that they have abilities in and some areas that are they don't have abilities in, but it's not, a disability, right? So that was kind of interesting to kind of look at those in distinction between each other. Is that a correct interpretation?
Yeah, I mean, ableism just means that a certain ability, right, is expected or people like. There's no judgment to it, right? We all, I mean, from the time we wake up, we expect certain abilities, right? And different people, different ones. I mean, I do this with my students all the time. What like around ability privilege is really which abilities do they take for granted? Like, for example, to have electricity. You take that for granted. Some places right have rolling blackouts. So they don't take that for granted because they can't, right? And so, but then when you have this as an ability with essential, then you can decide what you want to do with that and which ones do you want to provide, right? Do you want to provide like equity, diversity, inclusion, so in an enabling way? Like sustainable development was supposed to enable a better human nature relationship. Or do you want to use that with the purpose of disabling, like they did with, I mean, rationality, right? So women can't vote, right? That's why I make a distinction between ableism and disableism.
Yes, that makes sense. Okay, I think we have another question coming in. So Alex, if you want to just type your question in the chat box.
He might also just wants to do his presentation. I think he's the one after me.
I actually checked with him about that, and he
Yeah.
said that he does have a question. So, um, well, he said he could jump to do his presentation, but we have a few minutes.
Okay.
So, okay, on time. Alex, if you want to ask the question, we have time for that.
Oh, okay. I guess I am unmuted. Sorry. Typing is slow. I do one key at a time. So, I, I I'm trying to kind of articulate the question, but I hope you can get at what I'm saying here is I'm thinking of some local activism that's been going on, specifically around uh, uh, conflicts between a car-centric environment and expansion of lower carbon footprint modes of transportation. And as we are now locally, we're looking at adding like more bike lanes. There are certain members of the disability community that are very tied to their cars, and that's partly due to their disability, and um, have a desire to have parking in very close proximity to commerce. And something that I saw was those members of the disability community that are very passionate about being able to have access to that parking actually shutting out the community members with disabilities or not listening to them who can cycle, who use, adaptive tricycles, who were trying to give more concrete substantive input to how to make more inclusive, accessible street and urban design that allows for some cycling. And then, but so I'm wondering about the ability expectations within the disability community and kind of almost like hierarchies of needs and activism within the disability community. With me, that conflict kind of highlighted that.
Oh, sure. I mean, we know this, we can go back historically, the curb cut, right? Blind people need to set up differently than a wheelchair. Right, that's one of the problems. I mean, that we all the time use the disabled people as one group, but you have totally different realities. Right, the walkability discourse, urban design is totally useless. Right, and I actually wrote about that because it assumes certain normative ways of walking, and it only stops at the front of the building, which doesn't do you any good if you can't make it into the building. Right, so for disabled people, the walkability discourse is very problematic. But in general, yes, I mean, with a curb cut, it took a long time to come up with a design which works for both. And that will be the same with a car. Not everyone can use, I mean, tricycles and so on. So some, right, and depending also on the distance and so on, and if depending where you live, and you don't want to use like public transportation because like subways, because you never know whether the elevators work. And there's actually, right, so a lot of disabled people don't even travel anymore, like airplanes, because their wheelchair gets broken. But trains are no right, no really, I mean, right, another solution, because trains are normally not very wheelchair accessible, at least in Europe they aren't. And so it goes on and on, right? So everyone has hierarchies. We have it between social groups and within social groups. And so that all has to be dealt with, but that also is one issue for burnout, right? Because, I mean, if you feel, right, you can't say what you have to say, then, I mean, you might not bother even doing it. So, and so that is with the cars, I mean, for sure. But I mean, like London, inner city, if you would not be able to drive in the city, there is no alternative for wheelchairs, really, because they can't use the subway. Right. So it's really all locally depending what, I mean, what would work. But I think there, even within the disability group, there's not necessarily a good understanding of each other, what you really need. I don't know how many people know about the single straw and right who needs it, and that there is no replacement. Short of that, you really look into that, you will not be exposed to that, right? So I don't know whether that answers Alex, I mean, question or comment.
Oh yeah, a comment, I guess, but yeah, that does. Thank you.
Okay, great. Gregor, thank you so much for your presentation. It was really eye-opening. Actually, really a lot to discuss after that, I think, and a lot to think over um, in terms of how we can have a more liberated society for everyone, no exclusions. So we are going to move on now to our next speaker, and that is Alex Guinness. And so Alex is going to be speaking on climate's disproportionate impact on people with disabilities, ableism in environmentalism, and opportunities for action. And actually, that really relates to your question, Alex. So I can see that's a good segue into your talk. So Alex Guinness is a disability climate justice advocate and the founder of Accessible Climate Strategies. He previously managed the New Earth Disability Initiative at the World Institute on Disability for 6 years before founding Accessible Climate Strategies in 2020. Alex is currently a member of the Technical Advisory Council of the Integrated Climate Adaptation and Resiliency Program at the California Governor's Office of Planning and Research and part of the Equity Working Group of the Bay Area Climate Adaptation Network. Additionally, he is a regular freelance writer with United Spinal and the director of content for Climate Hive. So, Alex, thank you so much, and the floor is yours. Oh, we're having a problem with the sound. Hold
Oh,
on.
there we go. Okay.
Okay.
I wasn't allowed to unmute myself. I was trying to figure that out. Great. Yeah, thank you everyone. And let me get, I think this will work. Gotta get the right screen. So yes, this is um, uh, climate's disproportionate impact on people with disabilities, ableism and environmentalism, which is actually going to talk about a paper that Dr. Warbling mentioned there a second ago, and then opportunities for action. So there's me, there's my email if anybody ever wants to get in touch. My email, by the way, I should read this out, is alex@accessibleclimate.com. Here, an overview. I'm going to give a conceptual framework for understanding disproportionate impacts on people with disabilities, ableism and environmentalism, this is going to reference Dr. Fenney's. Actually, I think she got her PhD now. She was writing that while she was still studying on lessons from the UK. And then I'll talk about thoughts on the US and how that might be a little bit different. Obviously, this is an international group here. And then high-level actions for accessible, inclusive climate resilience. And this is Midjourney's version of someone with a spinal cord injury and a heat wave right here. So the interesting thing about climate change and disability is as far as I've seen, there's one paper that's been written on a conceptual framework, understanding the impact on people with disabilities, and this was a realist, a practical realist, something along those lines framework. I'll have to find it and send it over to Laura, but it was, as the name implies, kind of a practical realist, trying to approach things with nuance and then break them apart. I've put together my own framework, which is, I think, a little bit more mechanical. But essentially what it says is that you can break climate change up into numerous impacts on society. And actually then I would add on to that actions for adaptation, actions for climate mitigation, so reducing emissions and otherwise just kind of creating a more sustainable environment, and then climate dangers as well. So you have that on the climate change side, and then there are many different aspects of disability and aspects of living with a disability, and these can vary by location also. Dr. Warbling was mentioning some of the accessibility issues around trains in Europe, right? So if we're talking about clean transportation and accessibility there, it's going to be different in the US with the Americans with Disabilities Act, and trains that are more accessible, sometimes a little bit of a headache, versus in Europe where they are not as accessible, right? So talking about climate change impacts here, just some basics. I'm sure y'all are relatively familiar with them, but extreme weather. So within this framework, you could say, break them up into, in general, all right, we've got more extreme weather. In the US, there were, or specifics, we had 2 point some odd billion in flood damage last year. So you could talk about flooding, you could talk about lowland flooding, river flooding, coastal flooding, etc. You can break this apart into tons of different pieces, just the extreme weather side of climate change. Damaged infrastructure as a consequence of extreme weather. I just recently saw a presentation on the fact that sea level rise is going to be pushing up groundwater levels and leading to problems in coastal areas that go about twice as far inland as the actual inundation does. And that will lead to issues like damage of building foundations and damage of sewage infrastructure and other water management. Economic consequences. Certainly, you have property damage, you have contraction of the economy, which then can harm this next bullet point to government capacities. So when government is overstressed addressing climate change issues, and then when it has less revenue coming in because of these climate damages, then that shrinks government capacity to address other things, including disability and social services, creating effectively uninhabitable areas, through desertification, through repeat natural disasters that make it simply infeasible to be building things there, through coastal inundation, the list goes on. Dislocation and proactive migration. And there's certainly been conversations about how is this framed. So is dislocation and migration a national security threat at borders? Is it something that needs to be managed and addressed domestically with domestic migration, which is where most climate-related migration will be? How do we address that with language and policy that acts humanely as opposed to militaristically, viewing things as a national security issue? Spreading disease, the list goes on of different ways that disease can spread and the different types of disease that can spread, including through vector-borne diseases like Zika, or diseases like COVID that can actually be caused by damage to the natural environment, then pushing animals up against human areas, and then having diseases jump from animals to humans. Social upheaval and conflict. This is when you have conflict over reducing effective usable land area and then resources, then that can create social upheaval, conflict, and other disruptions kind of geopolitically. Those are just some of those. That's 8, right? Each of these, you could break them up into 8 more and 8 more and 8 more after that. There's hundreds of different aspects of climate change. On the disability side, you have broad categories such as mobility or intellectual and developmental disability. You have specific disabilities like multiple, if we were talking about mobility, you could have multiple sclerosis, and then you could also have spinal cord injury. Multiple sclerosis then is a almost flex disability in terms of categories, where chronic health is an issue there, right? Use of or need for government services. Some people need personal care attendant services. Some people need, career supports, whatever it might be. Use of medical care and attendance. That's another big one. Housing needs. So does somebody need wheelchair accessible housing? Do they need a single floor? Do they need other modifications? Does location of housing matter, right? That they're relatively close to services, medical services, other services, if they have difficulty commuting or otherwise limited amount of time during their day, then proximity to work could also be an issue. For mobility and transportation, you have issues of whether somebody can drive, whether they are transit reliant, and then actually getting back to the previous speaker talking about transportation and accessibility of transportation would be another issue that you might be concerned about. There are many economic barriers and then also potential opportunities for people with disabilities. I think certainly my opportunity as a consultant and working in kind of this niche field of climate change and disability, that's one. Those are relatively limited, but I will say that the opportunities for people with disabilities are sharing our disability expertise and trying to make the world a more accessible, inclusive place. So that's one of them. I think also if you have, say, expansion of remote work, then that provides opportunities for people with disabilities to then enter the workforce in ways that they wouldn't have been able to before. And then intersectional factors around race and income that basically compound different aspects of oppression. Now, what is climate change and disability? And this is the crux of kind of my idea and framework here, is it's every single one of these lines between the climate change impacts and the disability factors. So here, this is 64 lines. I mentioned there are hundreds, thousands of climate change impacts, and they vary depending on location. There are thousands of disability factors, and they vary based on the individual, also on location, on income, etc. And so you have more than 64 lines. And I tell people, if you are working on a single one of these lines, then you're working on some aspect of climate change and disability, and you have the opportunity to improve climate disability justice in your work. So if someone wants to get into this, wants to make a difference, that actually chances are they already are to a certain extent. and then that they can figure out how to frame their current work and their current activism in terms of climate and disability, and kind of feel like, okay, we're addressing more than we originally thought that we were. So that's the framework. I'm going to talk just some bullet points about this article, Ableism and Disableism in the UK Environmental Movement by Deborah Finney. It's available there if anybody wants to take your phone out and use this QR code. Otherwise, this bit.ly, I tried to compress it, but if you search for that, it is available at academia.edu for free for download. So it highlights different sustainability paths, what they call weak sustainability, which is economic growth and technological progress. The technological progress can really help to reduce environmental impact and hopefully move things toward a situation where the economic growth has a lower environmental impact overall, simply because the technological progress is outpacing the economic growth. Then there's strong sustainability, which is degrowth and what they call traditional independence. So my ability to farm and garden in my backyard. Fenney's study featured interviews and focus groups with 37 participants with broad environmental concerns. These were participants with disabilities. They participated in various types of environmental NGOs and intentional communities. It wasn't all bad. Some felt empowered and appreciated efforts within those NGOs and communities at inclusion and access. But there were many concerns. These include that physical access was often an issue, especially with outdoor activities and meetups, and there was minimal or no effort to try to increase accessibility, or there were really no opportunities to increase accessibility while still doing the same type of activity. There was lack of accessible information, including non-compliant websites, and information about accessibility. So if individuals were trying to figure out how they could participate, there was minimal information on how to do that, and therefore they just kind of either faded away or otherwise did their best and occasionally kind of flailed. Accessing and attending protests was difficult to impossible because of crowding and then because of other accessibility issues. There were implicitly ableist discourses, especially around cycling and physical activities, as being necessary to succeed in a climate change world and necessary to reduce one's environmental impact. Some individuals felt judgment on unsustainable aspects of disability, including using cars, and then also animal tested meds. I certainly know that's an issue here with some of the members of this group, and just kind of this conference in the past has talked about issues of animals and animal testing. So some kind of takeaways here, though, really were about the importance of people with disabilities being actively involved in these spaces, and then also the positive impact that we can have. So it says disabled people's perspectives, however, also have the potential to problematize the simplistic binaries and ableist assumptions in the environmental movement and discourses. This can create both risk and opportunity for disabled people engaging in environmentalism. It also says, without the expertise and lived experiences of disabled members, gains made by the environmental movement might lead to further exclusion of disabled people, especially if those gains lead to changes in government policy and infrastructure and the built environment. Moves toward inclusivity will require the participation and leadership of disabled people if they are to be effective. This is kind of the classic nothing about us without us. In the interest of time, I'm going to skip this next slide and just get to my last one, which is broad actions on what to do. So as I said, nothing about us without us. So maximize disability inclusion and participation in resilience efforts. Develop sustainable and accessible built environments. So this could be, really a balance. I will say that the conversation about walkability, I am an advocate for more compact urban density for environmental impacts. Sprawl is incredibly environmentally damaging. As a wheelchair user myself, I find that denser urban environments are actually much easier for me to live in and get around in. And I believe that in general, they are more accessible environments. They're easier also for seniors who develop disabilities to then downsize within their own communities and live in places like condos or apartments. Finally, or not finally, next bullet point would be having disability inclusive disaster response and recovery. This has been the largest focus for the disability community in the past. Then prioritizing weak sustainability while safeguarding government and social services. My concern about the degrowth movement is that shrinking tax revenue then will eat into government and social services. This is a constant concern for people with disabilities and kind of a difficult relationship sometimes between the economy as a concept, the problems with capitalism, and then also the need for government revenue and social services to keep ourselves going. Challenging any strong sustainability that has ableist assumptions or disableism, looking for win-win opportunities that increase sustainability, access, and inclusion, and do it for the broadest range of disabilities possible. We want to pursue universal access wherever possible. And then finally, and this gets to the shortage of research, the previous speaker is to have more research, then also have policy development for specific pieces of the climate disability puzzle. For example, heat waves and spinal cord injury. That's just one that I've pulled apart, one that's they are kind of important to me personally. So that's that. I think we got time, not too much time, but a little bit of time for questions.
Thank you so much, Alex. That was a really fantastic presentation. A lot of really important and really very relevant information, especially for people involved in ecology movements and climate justice movements and, all how that all relates to disability. So we do have a question from Daniel. How do you deal in your framework when there are conflicting access between disability groups and individuals when it comes to hearing disability voices for access needs for climate, which leaves very little room for individuality and individual, I think, oh, yeah. His his computer froze, so
Oh, no worries.
1 second, I'll let him speak. So Daniel, I think you can speak now.
Okay, yeah, so basically what I was saying is, for disability voice for, access needs for climate policies, which leave very little room for individuality and individualism. I'm on a disability inclusion committee for Metro in the Portland area that includes a lot of parks and other stuff, and that's what's been like a hung jury. So the leaders just basically decided that we don't even need to have a consensus and make sure that everyone's voices get heard. So, like as you mentioned, Dr. Janice, about access needs, I'm autistic, so I have different access needs, and working at home, is particularly being in Section 8 in a studio, is very inaccessible. So I need to be able to work in person, and my latest diagnostic update is advocating that as an accommodation. With the smart growth, that is very inaccessible. Sensory, a lot of the smart growth is sensory inaccessible, especially in the United States, where they don't respect the need for open green spaces, trees, issues with noise and light and electromagnetic pollutions and stuff. So there are all kinds of sensory issues. And also, I've been involved in my local neighborhood. A lot of seniors in my neighborhood also have real issues with sensory accessibility with excessive high density development. I think high density is the right idea, but it needs to leave space between people and space for community, space to connect with the non-human world and with trees and parks and flora and fauna. And so how would you address that?
Well, I mean, I'm kind of narrowing this down to just urbanism, is what I'm getting a little bit from this. But I think, in terms of sensory overload, I don't have a solution around folks who have electromagnetic sensitivity. I wish I did, but I really don't in terms of that. In terms of sensory overload, obviously light and light pollution are always going to be an issue. Noise pollution is really car noise pollution, right? If you look at what's happened in Paris, where they've not entirely eliminated cars, but mostly eliminated cars, the amount of noise has really reduced. So I think like this, I'm just getting to one bullet point here and trying to be on a positive note of it. There are larger issues that we need to grapple with that then I think if we grapple with them correctly can help situations like you're talking about with sensory overload, right? If we can, and you can still make it so that, there's automobile access for the people with disabilities that truly need it. But for folks who otherwise are able to ditch cars, that doing so would help with noise pollution, would help with, I think, psychological disability and stress. The research around the really physical and psychological impact of noise pollution. It's incredibly damaging. So there are ways for us to improve health, mental health, reduce sensory overload in those ways. And I think that, building tall and leaving some space for parks and green spaces is really important. The environment is, and then preserving, say, transit access to better preserve green space would also be valuable there. So each one of these is a difficult, the connection between the two columns, each one of them is difficult, but I hope that's helpful. I've been trying to grapple with urbanism more lately because I really view kind of housing in the built environment as so integral to a bajillion different things, but also climate resilience.
Okay, actually, we have Daniel with another question. So Daniel, you can speak.
Thanks for mentioning about building tall. That was a good point. I also have access issues with building tall. I lived in a Section 8 building back east in the Silver Spring, Maryland area. I ended up twice in the emergency room for insomnia panic attacks, largely because of the light above it. I would say that I'm not partial to single standing homes, and I live in a building, but I have to, as an access need to be able to live on a first floor. I can live, so I would say middle type, but trying to make things like Vancouver, British Columbia, where you have like 20, 30-story people living is inaccessible. I would say lower rise apartments work for me, garden apartments, smaller stuff. Yeah, so even like building high, and then a lot of times there are a lot of safety issues with surveillance and whatever. There's a place called Waterfront in Portland. I don't really feel safe in that park because they've created there because of all the high buildings, and I feel like they're being constantly watched. So there's a lot of issues is that the stuff doesn't. So still a lot of what gets preserved in there is not adequate based on my experiences. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's there's definitely a need for missing middle housing. I think the issue is when it's a dichotomy of towers and single family homes, right? So and single family homes and sprawl that's not an accessible built environment for many reasons. Some single family homes are, right? I think denser, missing middle kind of things, but sprawl as an overall urban design is unsustainable, and that's something we need to grapple with. Yeah, I you know, I think what you're bringing up brings up that there are many, many, many different disability experiences and many things that we're addressing in climate change, and many points of conflict too. So, concerns. None of this is easy.
Okay, thank you so much, Alex. Really appreciate it. Really, really important topic. And I'm very glad that we included something on climate justice and ecoability and disability, because uh, that's something that, really needs to be focused on in the years coming ahead, especially. I'm going to see if we have any more questions. It doesn't look like we do. Um, yeah, I think that's it for today. Unless you
Thank
have
you all.
something, because you have a few minutes left if you want to just share something in the last few minutes.
I mean, oh gosh. I I don't have too much. I think I don't know. The talk about burnout got my little brain wheels going, having been in environmental spaces, and knowing that so much of this kind of activism that goes around, b- built environments, that goes around infrastructure, that goes around government planning, that goes around need for resources and money, is just constant battles and fights. And I even found myself kind of gravitating a little bit more toward, and now figuring out how to do a little bit more in the private sector.
Mm,
Because nonprofit work is kind of emotionally draining sometimes, right?
right.
So I just want to say thank you for bringing that up. I think I did not say it within this presentation really, but in the Nothing About Us Without Us, one of the things I brought up, and I hope just gets more focused on in general, is hiring of people with disabilities in anything climate. That the fact that, I'm for profit, nonprofit, wherever, whatever, but if you can have someone with a disability and that lived experience and maybe those connections with activists, and put them in a place where they are in the renewable energy development for-profit company, they might have the occasional idea of better marketing to, or better supporting renewable energy installation in the homes of people with disabilities, right?
Right.
That idea might come up. That would then enable people with disabilities to live more sustainable lifestyles. That would make it so that we don't get locked out of the green transition and potentially create that divide a little bit more. So, there are, I think the uh, climate business community really needs to figure out how to improve hiring of people with disabilities. I think that the disability hiring agencies within government need to do more to actually help steer people with disabilities toward environmental and climate work in any sector, for-profit, government, academic, whatever it might be. Um, and I had another idea there, and it disappeared into thin air. So, yep.
Well, I'm going to say that's really interesting, because I remember Dr. Walgreen bringing up labor as the reason. If I remember rightly, he said something about labor being why that population was overlooked. And that actually reminded me of kind of this leftist idea of, this fixation on the workers are the ones who have the power. And, anybody who's kind of shut out of that doesn't have any power and therefore is overlooked. And so it's interesting that you brought that up, because I felt that related, kind of back to that again. So that was important.
Yeah, and I think that there are, I mean, there's that leftist, and then also knowing like some anarchist spaces. I will ask critical questions of, okay, so how do you support people with complex medical needs? And there isn't one. So when there's no plan. Um, so when I think a lot of environmental activism falls within certain, say, leftist or anarchist spaces, which that it does. And like more power to those folks for focusing on environmental things. But yeah, it's concerning for people with disabilities just knowing that there are these kind of able-bodied assumptions and ableism within there.
Yeah, certainly the ANPREM, anarcho-primitivism. Yeah, ableism is a big issue with that ideology. So yeah, I hear you. Okay, thank you so much, Alex. This has been really, really interesting.
Yeah,
And
thank you.
yep, thank you. So we're gonna be moving on to our next speaker, which is Daniel Salomon. And Daniel is going to be speaking on getting to solidarity toward an interest based conflict resolution approach to resolving the conflict between ecoability, ability equity, and animal equity. So, Daniel Salomon is a neurodivergent autistic self advocate who is an environmental disability justice scholar working on his field papers in environment and critical disability as a PhD student in urban studies at Portland State University. Salomon centers adult autistic self advocates in his research. Salomon has a Master of Arts in Theological Research from Andover Newton Theological School and a graduate certificate in Science and Religion from the Boston Theological Institute. Salomon is serving on Metro's Committee on Disability Inclusion and received a grant from REI through the Willamette Partnership to research best management practices for inclusive neurodivergent outdoor spaces. Salomon is a 44-year-old early diagnosed autistic adult. Salomon is also an author and frequent contributor to the Institute of Critical Animal Studies Ecoability Initiatives. So, welcome, Daniel. We are so excited to have you speaking again at the conference this year, and looking forward to hearing your presentation. So, Daniel, are you with us?
Yeah, say unmute. I don't know what happened. I was with you a second ago.
With us now. So that's what counts.
What?
You're with us now, so
Oh, okay. Can you hear me?
yes.
Okay, that's great. Let me do screen share. Okay. Yeah, okay. Okay. So you can hear me?
Yep, we can hear you.
Okay, so getting to solidarity towards an interest-based conflict resolution approach to resolving the conflict between ecoability equity and animal equity by Daniel Salomon. As an autistic person, I need mutual respect. This paper will respectfully, sympathetically, and generously engage the various animal movements from the perspectives of ethics and political activism, critical theory, conflict resolution, and urban studies. Ableism affects me through two narratives of autism: tragedy and superhero. An example of a superhero is climate activist Greta Thunberg. Okay. Okay. Ah, maybe with the technology, I'm not, okay. Oh, okay. Okay, okay. Okay. The superhero narrative is basically a sample token autistic individual perceived by the ableist society as able to assimilate into ableist society and singled out for promotion, in the process making non-disabled people feel good about themselves and shaming the rest of the autistic community. Yeah. The tragedy narrative I received for most of my 40 years, I'm 44 now, incompletely portrays autistic people as useless. The tragedy narrative has led to discrimination from professional level employment appropriate to my level of education and skill. From tragedy to superhero, society has gone beyond the tragedy narrative for the most part. It is still stuck on the superhero narrative of autism. I'm going to start with Temple Grandin. For example, there's another example of a superhero as defined above. For example, I have personally run into, as part of my lived experiences, some who say superstars on the autism spectrum, like Temple Grandin, is the quote-unquote the new normal, which everyone with autism must live up to become leaders and have representations. Grandin, in one of her books, Developing Talent, Careers for Individuals with Asperger's Syndrome and High-Functioning Autism, the updated 2008, delineates what Grandin expects from others on the autism spectrum. Her overestimated expectation of what worked for her as the standard of success of what has to work for all people on the autism spectrum, even as she fully acknowledges our individual diversity. Why? Grandin is not a constructivist sociologist like a sociologist or anthropologist, or a critical theorist or an activist academic. Hence, Grandin's latest book, Visual Thinking, The Hidden Gifts of People Who Think in Pictures, Patterns, and Abstractions, 2022, being marketed on Amazon.com as Cognitive Science and Neuropsychology. So for who and for what? That's part of the problem. Grandin's economic self-interest argument, not how constructivist social scientists understand how capitalism works. Capitalism created by human beings, according to Marx, only cares about capitalists maximizing profit through stealing from the workers and from nature. Okay. Grandin is okay. So let's see, I think I missed the slide. Okay. Grandin is also both. She is both a consultant to the livestock industry on animal behavior and an autism spokesperson. Grandin's metaphors, ideas, and practices affect both the lives of autistic people and animals. Grandin has accomplished some of the goals of animal welfare by working with her artistic mammalian mind to empathize with animals' emotional needs, combined with sound animal behavior science, taking a pragmatic reformist approach. Grandin not only invented an operational, quote-unquote, humane slaughter system using the above criteria, Grandin even persuaded one half of slaughterhouses in the United States to use her system. She has also developed animal welfare audits, which McDonald's use and reviews. Grandin's slaughter systems involve a relatively simple checklist of clear and concrete criteria for reducing suffering in slaughterhouse animals based on what specific practices jar animal consciousness through fear and overstimulation for a comparative analysis of autistic consciousness with slaughterhouse animal consciousness. Okay. The sun is shining. Okay. The animal abolitionist critique of Grandin. Radical animal liberationists have critiqued Grandin for supporting animal welfare measures, such as factory farming is morally permissible so long as it is conducted humanely, versus the opposite approach of animal abolition, such as factory farming is immoral and must be eliminated. As an animal liberation advocate myself, my sympathy lies with abolition perspectives, not welfare. My critique of Grandin, as an autistic scholar with a strong liberal arts and social science background, I have concerns about Grandin's social conservatism, such as Grandin's attempt to repackage behavior modification for deleting negative reinforcement while keeping intact positive reinforcement without questioning the problems with both positive reinforcement and the applied behavior analysis narrative itself. For example, there is a critique which claims the ethical necessity to be internally motivated to do good for its own sake in humans through reason versus humans becoming dependent on the irrational authoritarian conformity of the carrot and the stick. Grandin seems to apply the carrot and stick consistently to both animals and autistic humanity alike. Grandin also takes a sociologically naive, apolitical, and judgmental approach when animals, autistic people, and even herself fails or is rejected, when in reality, personal failure and rejection is a natural part of learning and development and an essential path to success in the long run. On the other hand, Grandin perceives society as this natural entity, which from a constructivist social science perspective is anything but natural, but actually can be changed for our personal and collective actions. One way Grandin expresses her judgmentalism is through objectifying machine metaphors to describe animals and humans alike when describing our mistakes, even making comments like, quote unquote, this animal was ruined and this autistic was ruined. Grandin employing machine metaphors to describe living beings implies that our lives are replaceable parts in a complicated machine instead of individual beings with inalienable rights with an irreplaceable niche in a randomized whole. The most disturbing flaw in Grandin's metaphors, ideas, and approach is not Grandin or animal movement's fault. The autistic community has been hit particularly hard by the same assimilation and tokenism which has impacted the disability community at large. Grandin has been the token for the autistic community, allowed to speak uninterrupted as the Ableist Society appointed ambassador of the autistic community on all manners of autistic self-understanding, including animals, before everyone in the autistic community has had a chance to speak and tell our story. As critical animal studies scholars, we must challenge her tacky machine metaphors, sociological naive, essentialism or biological determinism to blame the victim, animal welfare tropes, and biased media representations which reproduces stereotypes and inequity. Okay. As critical disability scholars, we must recover the full spectrum of views about animals on the autism spectrum and provide radical alternatives to Grandin. Ideally, this process would also promote additional autistic voices to emerge in academia, the vanguard, the media, and popular culture. The limits of anecdotal evidence. Make sure that we collect stories and listen to silent voices of people on the autism spectrum from all races, nations, languages, ethnicities, religions, cultures, geopolitical contexts, genders, generations, situations, political, religious, cultural, economic, and family beliefs about animals. The summary of my critique of Grandin: the only problem with Grandin is that Grandin is too ableist. Grandin has definitely internalized ableism. Grandin is still stuck in the medical model of disability, has not made it to the social model of disability. Grandin promotes stereotypes of other autistic people. Autistic people are now being burdened with new stigmas, and when we engage professional and political spheres, including in the animal and ecological movements. Grandin is correct about one insight: her understanding of survivorship in light of oppression. In other words, empathy for animals. Some people who are autistic can profoundly empathize with the plight of animals who also have been poorly treated by society, recognizing in animal suffering the patterns of our own abuse and oppression. Grandin, who was bullied and isolated growing up, could recognize fear in animals, identified reducing fear and attentiveness to an animal's physical environment as something animals need. Autistic primatologist Dawn Prince Hughes, who was also bullied growing up, had her conversion to the animal cause when she saw a captive troop of gorillas teased and taunted at a city zoo. She stood in solidarity with the gorillas the rest of the afternoon and became a primatologist and ape activist. My autism and animal story. I too got my start in animal advocacy as a result of empathizing with being targeted and scapegoated for being different. Growing up, I witnessed wildlife managers welcome sports hunters into my suburban home to hunt native white-tailed deer and Canada geese with guns and crossbows. The wildlife managers used propaganda to claim that hunting these animals was for their best interest, as overpopulation could cause these species great peril. I became outspoken against such hunts, testifying at local meetings. The strengths of Grandin. Finally, we can give gratitude for Grandin's gift to our cause of increased knowledge about animal abuse. Grandin initiated unrestricted documentation of factory farm practices and malpractices, therefore reducing the most egregious, cruel farming practices by putting absolute limits on corporation treatment of animals. She also advanced an economic argument for morally considering animal interests using credible scientific evidence for emotion and intelligence in birds and mammals. Alternatives to Grandin. Prince Hugh's gifts are standing in solidarity with animal kind, credible scientific evidence for personality and culture in gorillas, coupled with a passion for great ape issues. The gifts I offer are consciously and systematically linking the oppression situations of animals and autistic people situated to a liberal arts and social science research. I also give these gifts to all life and to human eco-justice issues. Autism, animals, and intersectionality. I also agree that we need many more Indigenous, people of color, and women of color autistic ecologies and CRIP animal ethics to be recovered and told in first person. More non-Western autistic ecologies and CRIP animal ethics in the geographic South. We need to recover in first person the autistic ecologies and CRIP animal ethics of people in the autism spectrum who have been labeled low functioning and people in the autism spectrum who are nonverbal. Okay. The urban context. The urban context offers many unique possibilities for developing nonviolent relations with animals, individually, collectively, and institutionally. For autistic people living in climate gentrified neighborhoods, despite the problem of gentrification. Interspecies communications with proper physical distance of animals, and wild and domestic animals cannot be hunted in urban settings, making it possible for autistic people to, in an urban context, to get to know living animals as sentient beings, not as food, medicine, and clothing. Also in the urban context, we have access to vegan food systems, holistic medicines not experiment on animals, alternatives to furs and leather, and most importantly, we have other ways to commune with animals other than sadistic blood sports, bullying entertainment, and needing to slaughter animals to eat and survive. Also, it's important to be sensitive to the long, unsavory Western history of hate, structural racism, and political economic inequality, which continues to persist as we go further into the 21st century. We also have to be sensitive to the histories, cultures, and lifeways of Indigenous people around the world, as well as the unique ways many Indigenous people have traditionally worked with space as plays. How can animals and autistic people both get the social justice we deserve through conflict resolution? I am going to offer an alternative that addresses animal welfare abolitionist responses to disability animal relationships, which is not helping anyone. My alternative also addresses the disability animal false choice, considering that it's a false choice when making ethical decisions to choose between animal rights and disability rights. Such thinking is binary. We want to go beyond binary thinking. The conflict resolution model. Social justice is giving everyone what they need and some of what they want to survive and flourish, regardless of their functioning abilities. Even then, as expected, everyone then is expected to contribute to society as they are able and take only their fair share, so everyone gets social justice with costs and benefits being distributed equitably. Conflict resolution individualizes social justice, refusing to choose between lives. Conflict resolution contends choose between lives is an unnecessary win-lose situation which perpetuates injustice and violence when a win-win solution is possible for the right balancing, such as privileging needs over ideology, people over things, coming up with solutions which gives everyone social justice. Both social justice and conflict resolution take seriously empirical truths as a legitimate ethical moral category. Yeah. How can it be applied? The implications for the animal and disability movements cannot be understated. Not only are all people with disabilities and all animals entitled to social justice, but even the ecological whole is entitled to social justice, addressing disconnects that the environmental movement do. Justice is made possible through engaging conflict resolution processes like negotiation, reconciliation, arbitration, as well as nonviolent communication and coalition building. Also, some religious traditions have contended that some of their mystics have been able to engage in direct, unmediated interspecies conflict resolution with other species. So this model could also be applied to animal-human conflicts directly, like wildlife-human conflicts in the service, or even disputes of your own animal companion. I have provided a quick autistic argument for animal liberation based on social and environmental justice, interest-based conflict resolution, ecological holism, feminist communitarianism, and urban studies. Okay. Yeah.
That was amazing, Daniel. Thank you so much. Super fascinating. Really rich presentation, a lot of layers. Um, so I don't see any questions yet. So I'm going to ask a question and then see if anybody else pops up in the chat. So yeah, I was really fascinated by a lot of the issues that you raised. And one of them that kind of sparked my attention was, first of all, this idea of the, what she said about, this animal is wrong, and this autistic person is bad or wrong, incorrect. I don't remember exactly what word you used, but it was something to kind of indicate that they were inherently defective in some way, it seemed. And also, of course, her view of the world, in this very mechanistic way that everyone and everything is a machine. And it kind of reminded me of some research that I've been doing on the historical role of animal agriculture being used as a form of conditioning for humans that were seen as not quite, right, or not quite human, subhuman, and really kind of like coercing them into participating in animal agriculture as a way of humanizing them, because of course the correct role of the human is the dominator of the animal, the controller of the animal. And also this idea that in order to control the non-human animal, they must control the animal within. And this actually has a really long legacy, including very strikingly in the white colonizer attempts to quote unquote civilize the First Nations people. So I'm wondering if you are familiar with any of this, or if you see any sort of crossover there in what Temple Grandin is trying to do, in a sense, it seems, to her fellow autistic people, and kind of playing this enforcer in a way of using animal agriculture to quote unquote humanize them.
That's interesting, Laura. That's really interesting. Thank you for that. I never thought of it completely in that way. First of all, the exact word that I used was brewing. So yeah, exactly. And that also feels like not only is there an inherent defect, but it also feels like it has an economic overtone to it, and also a throwaway overtone. So once you're brewing, then you can be thrown away like trash, which is a very disturbing, to the concept of somebody being brewing and no longer useful. It's very disturbing language. So I just want to point out that the brewing was a key word. That's interesting. I never thought of that way. That's a really interesting insight. I mean, it's very possible. One thing is I noticed in there, is, and particularly it's getting, and particularly why I'm doing critical disability in urban studies is that, it seems like, because I feel that there's a real, I feel like it's significant that I do critical disability and critical animal studies within an urban context, as well as the environment, climate stuff. I feel like there's some very disconnect urban-rural divide stuff that's very, very thing, and I don't think a lot of what she does is really appropriate, culturally appropriate. And then, as I said in there, that it seems like the urban context basically has made it more difficult, has made it unnecessary to have all this killing of animals. Yeah, so that's really an excellent point. I did thank you so much for sharing that history.
Thank you. Maybe we can collaborate on something on that topic sometime. That would be interesting.
Sure, absolutely.
So we did get a couple of questions that came in. The first one is from Alex, more of a comment, actually. He said, this reminds me of the new trend of some dog owners using speech buttons to interact with their dogs. It's all over Instagram. Oh, it's big on Instagram.
Yeah.
And then we got a second, and this one I think is more of a question from Varun. This presentation was amazing. Thank you so much, Daniel. I was wondering if you could expand on any work you've come across about disabled folks in certain religious traditions being seen as having unique perspectives towards animal relationality. The reason I ask, as a Punjabi Hindu, I've grown up with stories around this idea of disabled individuals having unique relationality towards the non-human, which of course is what Temple Grandin claims to have. Yeah.
No, thank you for both of that. I'll respond to the religious one. I've actually, in a lot of my earlier books, particularly my Amazon book, I definitely have explored a lot of how, particularly coming from a Christian perspective and a Jewish perspective, the types of relationships different saints and prophets and holy men and women were able to have with animals. And they were able to have these like really nonviolent relationships with animals. We were able to like reason with them versus eradicate, like Saint Francis being able to talk to the wolf and ask him not to kill people and livestock, and then in exchange he got the village of Gubbio to take care of the animal, take care of the wolf. And you have all these beautiful stories about people preaching sermons to, like Saint Francis, and also and Celtic saints, and preaching sermons to birds and other animals. And so you have, and then you have beautiful stories about humans living non-violently and in harmony with animals, both in the Garden of Eden and in the Messianic age, known in Isaiah 11 as the peaceable kingdom. So I've actually done a lot within my religion, and also in my book, Confessions of an Autistic Theologian, I make a claim that a lot of these people, a lot of my favorite saints and stuff are autistic. So I would say that's good. And definitely, I've also gotten into definitely people in all the different religions are reporting similar experiences with animals. I've done a lot of, and of course, there's lots of that stuff in indigenous cultures and even in some agrarian societies. And it's part of, I know that I took a forest therapy class with Dr. Burns, and also did a Costa Rica. Part of her thing she has us do is have conversations with trees and ask the trees different questions and developing friendships with trees. So yeah, and I've also done a lot with Chelsea Glendinning, who's had similar experiences of talking to plants and other stuff. So this interspecies community thing is a real phenomenon, and it seems to cut across all the different religions of the world. And it's something that I've only seen within the last few years, something that's even being recognized and taken seriously by the mainstream environmental communities and stuff, and science people. Have this whole idea of having a relational worldview, and that humans are part of nature, and that humans have a niche in nature, and that it's possible for humans to live non-violently with nature, not just live non-violently, but live in non-violent relationships, and not just with domestic animals, but wild animals too. It's really fascinating stuff. So I hope that that helps at all. I mean, a lot of my published works already, that's a major theme that keeps coming up. And then the other one about dog buttons, yeah. Ooh, woo, yeah, I know. It does seem like that the artificial intelligence, there definitely seems, and there's even articles on it, it does seem like this artificial intelligence, it seems to have overlap with animal intelligence, and no, it's very strange in that a lot of the artificial intelligence is actually being based on animal intelligence, I've heard. I don't know much about it, however, but that's a really interesting point. So I hope this is an adequate response. Laura?
Yes, thank you so much. That was really excellent, Daniel. Really, really fantastic presentation. Very thoughtful.
Sure, thank you.
Okay, thank you. So we are going to be moving on to our lunch break. So we're going to have a 40-minute break. We will reconvene at 12:10 Mountain Time. So whatever region you're in, you have to calculate it to come back. If you're on the East Coast like me, that will be 2:10 p.m. And if you're on the West, it's going to be a little earlier. But yes, so it'll be 12:10 Mountain Time. We will be back with Cade Brainan, and looking forward to it. See you then.
Yeah. Really? Yeah.